Hi everyone, welcome to your lecture on sociological investigation. In this lecture, we're going to look at basic research and other terms related to research that you would conduct in sociology. The basics of sociological investigation. Well, sociological investigation requires two key requirements. You have to look at the world using that sociological perspective, divorcing yourself from your own thoughts or experiences, and then be curious and ask questions. When we say we know something, it can mean a lot of different things. You may know your belief in a religion or God. You may know something because you heard an expert say it. And you may know something because most average people agree upon it. If we're looking at sociological investigation, we have to find ways that we can prove what it is that we're talking about. Sociology is a type of science. It requires a logical system to build up its base of knowledge. Science is a form of truth, and it uses systematic observations, it uses research. So for this purpose, sociology is a science. Scientific knowledge is based on empirical evidence. It's something you can verify. You can see it, you can taste it, you can touch it. Information we can verify with our senses. Scientific evidence can sometimes contradict common sense or the explanations that we have for social behavior. This is why sociology is going to be a science. It's going to look at research that's conducted along the scientific method. And that way we know that that research isn't contaminated necessarily with too much bias. It's important to look at common sense versus scientific evidence. Just because there's a statement that is common sense, like the differences between men and women, well, it's just human nature. Women are more emotional and men are far more logical. Well, that's actually not human nature. That's a social construct. It's something that societies have created, and not every society believes that. Things like a quiet man is a thinking man and a quiet woman is usually mad, or women are the frailer of the two sexes. Not all of these things necessarily hold truth when we get into the science of it all. When we talk about conducting research in sociology, we talk about scientific sociology, using a systematic observation to determine what's going on within a society. And like Comte had once said, we use positivism. We assume that there's an objective reality, that we can say something positively exists. The job of the scientist is to discover the reality, to gather the evidence, and show that it can be verified. The scientific method you guys have seen over and over and over again since the fourth grade. You identify a problem, you review the literature, you formulate a hypothesis that you intend to test, you collect data after you test it, and then you simplify that data into statistics. Develop a research design, collect data, analyze data, state the findings and conclusions. That's all your scientific method. Now here's the thing. Scientific method can apply to, obviously, experiments, but surveys, naturalistic observations, and other forms of research. So what should sociologists study? Well, that's huge. It can be anything. It can be differences in gender or race. It can be policies that are put forward by our government. It can be why poverty still exists in the United States. There's an endless list of things that sociologists can study. The question is, how do they study it? And that's where we look at the methods of research. It has to be a systematic plan for conducting or gathering this information. We'll look at experiments, surveys, secondary analysis, and field research. Experiments are going to be the only form of research that allows you to make a cause and effect statement. The reason this is because you put people in highly controlled conditions and you try to eliminate any of the confounding variables or biases that might exist in those situations. Experimental research is explanatory. It doesn't ask just what happened, but it also can try to answer why it happened. Again, giving you cause and effect. Anytime researchers conduct experiments, they're going to formulate a hypothesis, a guess, an unverified statement about the relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. Your independent variable is going to be what you change. It's going to be your cause. Your dependent variable is how you're going to record the effect of that change, and that's going to be your effect. Sometimes when we do experimentation, we'll introduce something called a placebo. The experimental group would get the independent variable, so we can see the change or the cause and the effect, but we might have a control group, and we might give them something that seems very similar to that change, but has absolutely no power. A really easy way of explaining this is looking at something where I give one group of people a regular Coca-Cola, and I want to see how caffeine impacts their ability to solve problems. I give another group a decaf or an uncaffeinated soda. So still Coca-Cola, but it's caffeine-free Coca-Cola. Their soda doesn't have the caffeine, and it would taste exactly like the regular soda. And I see how they deal with solving problems or puzzles. My control group is given a placebo. It's given something that seems like it should be caffeinated, and we see whether or not they're change in their mindset, whether or not their belief that this is a caffeinated soda, whether that changes their behavior, and if it changes it as much as the actual group getting caffeine. This helps us determine whether or not the independent variable really does truly have a cause. Most experiments are conducted in laboratories, and they try to employ as much control as possible. Other terms that you should be familiar with are concepts and variables. Concepts are mental constructs, ways that we represent the world in a really simplified form: race, economy, gender, religion. Variables, those concepts whose values change from case to case. So middle, high, and low income. Again, when we're talking about experimentation, experiments allow us to make these cause and effect relationships. The cause, or the manipulation, can lead to a change or an effect. The manipulation is your independent variable. The measurement, your dependent variable. The group that gets the manipulation, your experimental group. The group that you're using to just get your baseline data is your control group. Other things that we would look at. Variables may also be quantitative or qualitative. Think quality and quantity. Quantitative variables can be given a numerical value, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. While quantitative variables, well, you can't give them a number. I can't give you a number for marital status. So here we're not necessarily looking at what can be numerically gathered, but we're looking at the quality of the response, the identity of a membership in a category. You can also have something called intervening variables. Now, again, in sociological research, we're not dealing with straightforward cases. People and societies are messy, and there's usually more than one reason that something happens. An intervening variable is a variable that can change the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. If we're looking at poverty as our independent variable, and we want to see how poverty impacts the number of days each month a family goes without food, well, we might sit there and say that families don't go without food even if they're impoverished. But if we look at intervening variables like government support programs, food stamps, that might be the reason why poverty doesn't lead to going without food. So when we look at research in sociology, we have to be very aware that there are other things at play, and often things that we can't necessarily control for. And those would be these intervening variables. How would you measure someone's social class, their income, occupation, education? How would you measure love or family? You can measure all of those things as long as you choose to be incredibly specific about what aspect that you're measuring. If you want to measure love, you might want to specify, for the purposes of your research, love will be defined as a person's accelerated heart rate. I know that might not be love for everybody, but that might be enough for your research. Operational variables or operational definitions applied to variables allow us to take really kind of non or hard to define concepts like love and decide what it is that we're looking at and allow us to be very specific, which allows other people to later look at our research and go, they're looking at heart rate as an indication of love. I can redo their research. We want our research to be consistent. We want it to be reliable. When we look at reliability, a measure of reliability is how often you can repeat the research and get the same result time and time again. Now, reliability doesn't mean validity. You can do bad research and get the same results over and over again, meaning that your research isn't valid, but your data is reliable. And the reverse is true. You can do really good, valid research, but because there's so many variables that you don't account for, you get completely unreliable results. Reliability, getting the same results time and time again. Validity, ensuring that what you measure is what you intended to measure. So here again is validity. What you measure, your precision in measurement, it's what you intended to measure. So if you wanted to measure social class, you need to be very precise about what it is that you're measuring. Is it income? Is it education? Is it the community that the person lives in? What questions are you asking to narrow down and define exactly what it is that you're looking at? You have to be careful with the Hawthorne effect when you're conducting any research, to include experimentation. The Hawthorne effect is when a subject becomes aware that they're being researched and maybe they start to change their behavior. You guys have all seen something very similar to this when an administrator walks into the room, and not only does the students change their behavior, so does the teacher. When we meet face to face, we'll talk about the Stanford County Prison Study and go through a couple questions about that. So since we'll talk about that in person, we're going to skip past it right now. Surveys are going to be a method that allows us to collect a large amount of information quickly, and that information is usually going to be something that is typically descriptive rather than explanatory, often opinions or people's ideas about things. Surveys are always directed at populations who are the focus of the research, but you would never use the entire population of Fauquier County. You would use a sample. Samples are going to be part of that whole, and what we want to get is we want to get what's called a representative sample, a collection of people that are a good reflection of that overall population. To get a good representative sample, we're going to use a process called random selection. Without intent, we are going to select a certain number of people from a population. So if we wanted to use Fauquier County, I might go to the registrar's office, or I might use an old-fashioned phone book and count off every 200th person in the phone book. That gives everyone an equal chance of being part of that sample population, and it should give me a good distribution of people across the board. Sometimes, especially with people, a random sample is impossible. So you might use something called snowball sampling. You might have something like people with disabilities, and you want to talk to them about something. Well, it might be that a person with a disability is more in tune with other people through groups and organizations. So whatever you want to talk to them about, they could then possibly tell you about two other people. And you could talk to those two other people, and they could then tell you maybe each about two more people. So snowball sampling has some bias involved, but if you have a very specific or particular population that you need to address, this is where you get that. Again, surveys can be questionnaires or they can be interviews. Questionnaires can be open-ended or closed-ended. An open-ended questionnaire allows a person to elaborate on and speak freely, where a closed-ended questionnaire is what we'd call a Likert scale, or forces a person into a choice. You have to select from strongly agree to strongly disagree. You have to choose from maybe 4 pre-selected answers in a multiple choice. Questionnaires also must be pre-tested. Make sure that they're normed against a population and that the questions make sense to people taking them. Secondary analysis is another form of research that is done in sociology. It takes advantage of research that's already been done by other groups or organizations. You use pre-collected data. So while you're doing your research, you may choose to take in things that you get from the US Census. It's sometimes easier to go to larger organizations that do research on voting or prisons or just the general US Census because it's good data that you might not be able to collect in that volume by yourself. It comes with advantages and disadvantages. One, definitely saves time and money, and it could be better than what you do on your own, but it might not be in the form that you need, and different agencies use different data collection procedures, so you might not know exactly how they got to their statistic. There are several types of field research that we'll look at, and field research helps when you can't quantitatively measure what you're looking at, and it's better to see people in their natural settings. One type is case studies. Sometimes there's an incident or a group of people or a community that you want to investigate, and you can't do it in any other way. So you do a deep dive on them. You try to find out as much about their case or their situation as possible. And then you hope that you can maybe generalize some of that information to similar situations. Another type of research is participant observation. Now, naturalistic observation is what you would see in nature documentaries where you watch but you don't get involved. Participant observation is a little different. You watch but you become part of the group. In fact, you might learn more by joining the society that you're trying to investigate. This research is descriptive and it can be often explanatory. William White used this when he was looking at a poor neighborhood in Boston. It was hard for him to get an in because he wasn't from Boston. But as he spent time and became friends with a person, that person then introduced him to others, and that person was a key informant. In other words, without this friend that he had made, there was no way that he was going to get insight into this neighborhood in Boston. With the key informant, he became part of the neighborhood and he had a deeper and better understanding of the inner workings of that small subculture. We're not going to spend time going really deeply into statistics, but you guys should know some basic statistics like means of central tendency. These are going to be basic statistics that help you see kind of the core group of your data. Your mean, which is your average, your median, which is your middlemost number, and your mode, which is your most commonly occurring. With correlations, we're looking at the relationships between two variables. They're not cause and effect. They just happen to have some sort of trend that they both follow in relationship to each other. Correlations can be either positive or negative, meaning that two variables travel together in the same direction, being positive, or that as one variable increases, the other one decreases. No matter what, with correlations, we are not manipulating a variable to see what the result is. We're looking at two different variables and just seeing how they may relate to each other. Therefore, we cannot establish causation. Correlations can also have what we'll call spurious correlations, false associations between two variables caused by some other third variable. In your textbook, they talk about the fact that you might feel comfortable saying people with long arms also have long legs, but you wouldn't say having long arms causes you to have long legs, or by having long legs it caused you to have your arms grow longer. There's some other variable that causes these two things to happen in relation to each other. Spurious correlations can be discovered through scientific control, and you neutralize the effect of one variable in order to assess whether or not there's really a true relationship. I'll give you an easier example. Here are two more spurious correlations. They're actually real correlations, but there's a missing element to both. As ice cream sales increase, so do violent crimes. Does that mean that the more ice cream we eat, the more violent we become? And the answer is no. There's a missing third factor that better explains why these two variables seem to have a relationship. As your shoe size increases, so does your ability to solve complex mathematical problems. So does that mean people with really big feet are really good with math? And the answer again is no, there's a missing component. Well, here's your ice cream and crime. Well, when it's warmer out, we eat more ice cream, and when it's warmer out, there are more crimes. There's more crimes when it's warmer out because there are more people out doing things, and so the victim pool increases. And when you're out hot and sweaty, having a cold, refreshing treat seems like a good idea. So ice cream isn't going to be the reason that you get robbed, but being outside in the heat and unaware of what's going around you while eating your ice cream might be. Your large feet don't make you super smart at math. However, your feet have grown as you have aged, and you should be better at complex math than you were when you were 2. So, again, it's not that math and shoe size have anything to do with each other. There's a missing third element, the fact that people who are older have larger feet, and therefore should also be better at math than people who have really tiny feet, like babies. There's an entire book about causal or spurious correlations. Like this one right here. Letters in the winning word of the Scripps National Spelling Bee is highly correlated with the number of people killed by venomous spiders. The overlap's almost perfect. The thing is that we would be able to stop people getting killed by venomous spiders by making the words in the spelling bee shorter if this was causal. And obviously this isn't causal. So we're just seeing two variables that seem to have a strange relationship to each other. The number of people who drowned by falling into a pool and films Nicolas Cage appeared in. Again, you start to see a lot of overlap in the data points here. But Nicolas Cage films don't cause people to go fall into pools and drown. An easier way of looking at correlation versus causation, if you see a bunch of people outside raining and they have umbrellas, you might assume that umbrellas cause rain. However, a good way to test whether or not this is a correlation or this is actually causal is to go outside with an umbrella. And if it doesn't rain, then maybe the umbrellas don't cause the rain. Researchers need to be objective, not just have an objective, but be objective. In other words, remove themselves from the research, what Max Weber called value-free research. Remove yourself from the scenario and see the world as it is. Researchers must control their feelings, their opinions, study the world as it is rather than how they think or wish it to be. One way to limit distortion is through replication. If you can do research more than once with the exact same hypothesis, with the same constraints, and get the same data again, chances are you know that what you have studied is correct. Repetition of research by other investigators to assess accuracy. That's replication. There are limitations to scientific sociology. One, human behavior is really complex, and sometimes it's hard to predict, but even harder to control. Humans respond to their surroundings, so just having a researcher there can affect the behavior. Social patterns change, so what was true in 1960 might not be true in 1970, 80, 90, or now. Because sociologists are part of their world, sometimes it's really hard to do what Weber suggested and be value-free. With gender research, you have a whole other host of issues. You can't take any research from a purely male or female standpoint because then you negate part of the population. You can't overgeneralize or use data drawn from them to say something is absolutely true about all human behavior. You can't sit there and say that gender doesn't matter. It obviously does. You can't use double standards. You can't judge men by the way that we would talk about women, and you can't judge women by the way that we would talk about men. And sometimes the reaction that you might get from a subject is a reaction to the researcher's sex or gender. So when we talk about gender in research, those issues can be really, really hard to separate out. And you can see it in other aspects of research. The last thing we'll talk about is ethics. Sociologists have to be fair. They have to be mindful of what they're studying. When they study, they must disclose all research findings and they may not omit any data. In other words, if someone lies on your survey, you have to include it. They should make their results available to others and allow people to replicate their research. Subjects taking part in the research cannot be harmed. So basic ethics, you can't harm people. You have to protect the privacy of your subjects. You have to provide them with informed consent that allows them that knowledge of what they're getting into, that they will be kept confidential, and that they can leave the research at any time. And when you're doing research, if your research takes you away from America and to other countries, you need to deeply research that country and their culture to make sure that what you're doing is not seen as a violation within that society. Globally, it's much harder to do research because you have to come at it from a perspective of a person within that society. We'll look at the Blue Eyes video in class. This is a really interesting, essentially, experiment that was conducted back in the 1960s. Last couple of thoughts. The interplay of theory and method. We may use inductive or deductive logical thought, and in fact, in most research, we go in both directions. Inductive is going from reasoning that looks at a very specific observation and builds a general theory, where deductive does the reverse. It looks at general ideas and then tests them for specific things. Now, if you've ever watched Sherlock Holmes and you heard him say it's pure or simple deduction, well, that's actually incorrect. Sherlock Holmes would have looked at the scratches on a phone or the ink on someone's earlobe and gone and built a theory from it. He often did inductive and then later confirmed that inductive knowledge through deductive reasoning. He kind of did do both, but usually he started with inductive. In research, we definitely go back and forth between these two. So normally if we were looking at this in class, we would be building up to doing our own research, finding out what your topic was, doing your own research about that topic, figuring out how you were going to actually carry out your own research, looking at ethical concerns, deciding on a methodology, running that experiment or survey or whatever it might be, collecting data, and then sharing your conclusions. We're not going to be able to do it in the online format, but it is important for you to realize that as we start looking at any other research, that all researchers go through these rough 10 steps.